Hi, David here, and welcome back to the channel, looking at the automatic writings of early 20th century medium James Padgett. In last Wednesday's video, we looked at a message James received from his old law professor, Joseph Salyards, in which he shares his thoughts on why some people experience difficulties in adjusting to life in the spirit world. In this video, we're going to stay with Professor Salyards as he takes us through some broader reflections upon life in spirit, looking at people who have already been there for a time, but are still familiarizing themselves with their new environment. This message was written on April 13, 1915, so a couple of months after the previous one. We know from the public record that Joseph Salyards passed to spirit in 1885. So at this point, he has been in spirit for 30 years. And when we get into the message, we'll see why that's useful to know. This message from Joseph Salyards to James Padgett begins as follows. I am here, Professor Salyards. Well, I am here and will endeavour to write you my thoughts on what spirits may know about the laws of the spirit world after they have been in that world for a short time. As you know, I have been here for a comparatively short time. 30 years is a short time in spirit. And while my studies have been to a considerable extent in the study of these laws, yet I find that I have a limited knowledge of the same. And much of my information has been gathered from other spirits who have lived here a great many years and who have devoted their study and investigation to these laws. So one thing we're repeatedly reminded of within spiritualism is that we don't change just because the physical body dies. We are the same person with the same outlook, and the same mindset and knowledge that we had the moment before we left the body. Obviously, these things can change, just as they do in this world, but that is something that happens over time. As Joseph Salyards goes on to say, well, I first want to say that no spirit, by the mere fact of recently having made his advent to this world, has received any greater knowledge than he had when on earth. My knowledge of spiritual laws when on earth was not very extensive, and I found when I came into the spirit world that I did not know much more than I did before I came. And such is the experience of every spirit. As I continued to investigate these matters, I discovered that my capacity for learning was greatly increased, and that my mind was more plastic, flexible, and received this knowledge more easily than when I was a mortal. This is largely due to the fact that the brain, I mean the mortal brain, is, when compared to what you might call the spirit mind, a thing of much inferior quality, and not so capable of learning the cause and effect of phenomena. I am now undergoing a course of study that will, I have no doubt, give me wonderful information of these laws, so that ultimately I may become what you mortals might call a learned man. This is a former law professor being a little bit modest here, but he does make an interesting point. I have so often come across people in spirit telling that they find it much, much easier and therefore quicker to learn things than they did when they lived in a physical body. While we live in a physical form, our consciousness is shaped by having to process information that comes through the physical senses, and our ability to learn is affected by how physically tired we are, by the need to break time spent learning into small periods so as to attend to other things, and so on. When we're no longer in a physical body, our awareness has direct access to and experience of other things. Our awareness of things is no longer mediated by our physical senses. So we perceive things more directly and more quickly. Also, memory works better. We no longer access things through a physical brain, including our memories, because these are also replicated in the spiritual body that we retain at death. When you're trying to do things through a physical brain, repetition is an important part of making things stick well enough to be recalled easily. The spiritual body is much more sensitive, so every thought sticks. So you can see how much quicker it will be to learn new languages, for instance. One question I've seen people ask is how people in spirit can speak modern English when that wasn't one of their languages during their earthly life. Well, in the case of someone who has been in spirit for a couple of centuries, let alone a couple of millennia, how long does it take to learn English? Add to that the speed of learning in spirits, and you come to understand that it's perfectly possible for someone in spirit to learn English or any other modern language, purely because the opportunity to use a medium has arisen. Obviously, there will still be personal variation in enthusiasm and speed of learning, but I have come across people in spirit who have learned a new language when an opportunity to communicate presented itself. Anyway, to get back to Joseph Salliard's, he continues, the first and, to me, the most important law that I have learned is that man continues to live in the spirit world without his earthly body. This great law, while to you and to many others, is well known and is an established fact, yet to me was not known, as I had never had any experience in spiritualism and had never given any study to the subject. When I arrived in the spirit world, I learned that this law is one of God's truths, and that it is fixed and will never change, for all will survive the change of so-called death. The next great law that I learned is that no man can, of his own power, make his condition or position in the spirit world just what and where he would have it be. This is another fixed truth, and one which many spirits do not fully comprehend, for they think, or so express themselves, that all they have to do is exercise a little willpower, and they can move from certain conditions. But this is not true, for the law controlling this matter never has any exceptions in its operations. As we've seen in previous videos, all we take with us to spirit is who we are. And the evidence of that is how we have lived. Not just our words and other visible actions, but our thoughts, because they too are actions. We go to a place where we are not embarrassed by our nature. Or putting it another way, we go to a place that our nature is suited to. Wherever that is, there is nowhere else we can feel at home. Whether that's a pleasant place or an unpleasant one is entirely our choice, meaning that it is the sum total of our daily choices as to the kind of person we want to be. It's no good ending up in spirit and wishing things were different, or hoping we can will ourselves to a better place or state of being. It just doesn't work that way. That's something we have to start doing day by day. To this extent, being in spirit is no different to being in this world. As Joseph Salliard says, a mortal spirit, meaning someone living in the physical, can, in a way, determine what his destiny may be, but once fixed by this great power of will, which God has conferred on man, he cannot, by the exercise of that will, change that fixed condition until the laws of compensation have been satisfied. And even then, the change is not brought about by the exercise of his will, but by the operation of the laws releasing him from memories and recollections which hold him to the conditions that his life has placed him in. So when men think that they, by the exercise of their own will, can release themselves from a condition which they have made for themselves, they are mistaken. So what Joseph Salliards is saying here is that when we pass from the embodied earth life, there is then no choice in where the person we are puts us, because we have already made that choice and become the person we chose to be. Wishing things were different is simply wanting to change the past. Good luck with that, as we say. In spirit, as in this world, if we don't like where we are in life, physically and metaphorically, the choice we have is as to what we do next. If we're not sure what to do next or how to do it, that means deciding who we want to ask for help. As Joseph Salliards goes on to explain, of course, while a mortal or spirit cannot, by the exercise of his will, change his condition, yet, in order to secure that change, the will has to be exercised. This is because the help which comes from without is absolutely necessary to cause the change, which will not come unless man exercises the will in the way of desiring and asking for the help. So let not man think that he is his own saviour, because he is not. And if the help did not come from without, he would never be saved from the condition which he finds himself in when he enters the spirit world. You hear in your spirit circles and read in the publications about spiritualism that progression is a law of the spirit world. Well, that is all true, but it does not mean that a spirit, by the mere fact of being in the spirit world, necessarily progresses, either mentally or spiritually, for this is not true. Many spirits who have now been here for years are in no better condition than when they first became spirits. All progression depends upon the help that comes from outside the mind or soul of man. Of course, when this help comes, man has to cooperate. But without this help, there would be nothing with which to cooperate, and no progress could possibly be made. If a man depends upon his own powers exclusively, he will never progress. This law does not apply only to the soul's progress, of which you have heard us speak so often, but to the progress of the mind, and also to what might be called the purely moral qualities. I just want to pause there because it might be a bit puzzling to hear Joseph Salliards distinguish the soul from the mind. I think the best way of explaining that is simply to say that consciousness is an attribute of the soul, something we acquire and develop during our earthly life, and which continues to develop in spirit. Different people have different moral qualities. Different people have different ways of looking at things. Awareness varies from person to person, yet we are all souls with the same potential to progress. Progress, of course, will vary from person to person because we all acquire different personal qualities during our earthly lives. What Joseph Salliards has to say next on this is very interesting. Another law of the spirit world is that when a spirit once commences to progress, that progress increases in geometrical progression, as we used to say when teaching on earth. What Joseph is describing here is a kind of snowball effect, like reinvesting interest in a bank savings account rather than just spending it. Or if you think in terms of a graph, the same amount of progress each day would give you a straight line over time. Joseph is telling us that progress in spirit is not like that. It's more like a curve that increases exponentially over time. It's a bit like the Richter scale, or scales derived from it, that we use to measure earthquakes. A magnitude 5 quake isn't 25% stronger than a magnitude 4 quake, it's 10 times worse. So essentially what Joseph Salliard is telling us is that when it comes to spiritual development, small steps taken as early as possible bring massive benefits down the line, and that the process becomes self-reinforcing. I'm going to pause there for this video, as we're about halfway through this message, and it is quite a long one, with a lot to think about. I'll put an end card in this video that gives you the link to part 2. In fact, it should be coming up on the screen about now. There is also a link in the video description down below, so I shall see you shortly.